A man can buy acres, he can buy herds, servants, and the deference of a whole town when he lays out enough coin. But there is one thing money cannot lawfully purchase: a living thread to carry a name into the future. Silas Cade knew that. He also knew how to count risk and reward, how to size up a ledger and a landscape in the same patient glance. He liked neat solutions. He liked certainty. Romance, he had decided by hard experience, was a luxury that too often came with ruin. Evelyn Hart had learned about other things: the peculiar ache of wanting a child, the stubborn discipline of saving every nickel from a teacher's wages, and the steady humiliation of being deemed too plain, too clever, too much by men who measured a woman like one might weigh grain. By 32, she had answered 5 of those curt newspaper ads that promised a home and an heir without the nonsense of love. Each reply had come home like a closed door. When Silas's advertisement arrived in Maple Hollow, terse, practical, nearly clinical, Evelyn read it until the black type blurred into something that might be mercy. Seeking woman, desiring child, and able to maintain good home influence. No romance required. Wealth and security guaranteed. Willing to live on ranch. Right to High Meadow Ranch, Lycan's territory. No velvet promises, no poems, no grand illusions. For Evelyn, who had spent quiet nights imagining lullabies and small feet, those blank spaces were less cruel than the false courtships she'd staged before. She could be practical. She could give what was asked and ask nothing extravagant in return. 2 weeks later, a telegram arrived. Miss Hart. Stop arrangements acceptable. Stop. Train ticket reserved. Maple Hollow. Stop. Arrive. High Meadow, November 18th. Stop S. Cade. She left Maple Hollow with a single trunk, a tin box of savings, 3 books of poetry she couldn't bear to part with, and a knot of resolve so taut it hurt. Her sister Agnes tried to dissuade her at the station. "You don't know him," Agnes said, folding Evelyn's scarf with trembling hands. "What if he's cruel? What if he thinks you're merely a vessel? What if this is the only chance I get?" Evelyn answered. Agnes's silence was an answer of its own. High Meadow Ranch rose from the prairie, like a promise underbred with blunt honesty. Long lines of whitewashed buildings, a main house that caught the sun in its tall windows, barns and bunkhouses arranged with the same care Silas gave to his cattle. He met her on the depot platform, not as a lover, but as a proprietor greets a new foreman. A measured bow of the head, a handshake that was more sign of a contract than greeting. Silas was younger than Evelyn expected, not yet 40, with a face carved by wind and work and an expression that favored exactness. He wore a black coat that looked designed for business at 10 paces and battle at 100. His eyes were a cool steel, observant, assessing, impatient with sentiment. "We'll have time to review particulars on the drive," he said, his voice flat as a board. "This is an arrangement, Miss Hart, not marriage." For a long moment she let that bareness of purpose be exactly what it claimed to be. She was here for one thing: to be a mother. Everything else, affection, candles, and poetry, were negotiable extras she could live without if security and a child were guaranteed. Silas spoke with the grammar of ledgers. He owned 8,000 acres, ran 3,000 head of cattle, employed a dozen cowhands year-round. Domestic matters, he said, were the province of Martha Keene, the housekeeper. "You'll answer to her for daily management. You'll answer to her," his words pressed, and Evelyn felt the smallness of her role settle into place. Nursery and lessons, moral influence and lullabies. Not oversight of cattle or the company books. It stung, but then the allowance he offered, the comfort of the rooms, the physician he named, Dr. Alden Royce, trained at Baltimore, read like a practical safety net. The ledger of terms unfurled with a dry precision, conception and bearing. The heir were the prime obligations, compliance with medical regimen required, social appearances strictly controlled, financial allowance provided, correspondence limited, no involvement in ranch business. Paternity would be unquestionable. Discretion was a commandment. Evelyn signed what needed signing. She had known what she was doing when she posted that first letter. The language of compromise had been learned by years of closed doors. Still, when Silas pronounced, with businesslike finality, that their intimate duty would commence immediately, she felt the true chill of raw commerce. High Meadows' rooms were both grander and lonelier than Maple Hollow's square schoolhouse. Martha was efficient and skeptical, showing Evelyn to a room fit for a woman of breeding rather than the spare space a traveling teacher might expect. Evelyn found dresses in the wardrobe, clothes measured and ordered by Silas in Denver, and realized that even her clothing would be curated to appearance rather than warmth. Mr. Cade expects his companion to look the part, Martha said, not unkind, merely factual. Dinners were formal, the table set with china and crystal that reflected faces into caricatures of civility. Silas read cattle reports, spoke of markets and weather with a passion that surprised her. It softened his stony profile, but personal conversation remained bare-boned. He conducted emotions as he conducted the ranch, with efficiency, with discipline, and little tolerance for softness. Yet the nights were colder than the days. When Dr. Royce cleared her medically fit to proceed, the intimacy that began between Evelyn and Silas had the clinical start of a transaction. But human bodies and human needs rarely respect ledgers. What was meant to be mechanical turned combustible. There was a moment, the house asleep, the moon cutting silver across the parlor rug, when something in Silas broke the outer crust. He came to her with a question that wasn't in the contract. What were you like before all of this? It took him an hour, and a whiskey that smelled of cordite and bitter memories, to let words unspool. A marriage when he was 25, and a girl named Margaret who left him for court life in Denver, who found his ranch too quiet, his steadiness not a romance, but a suffocation. She'd taken her ring and a letter, and the life with it. He learned, Silas said, to extract emotion from relationships, to make arrangements rather than risk abandonment. The confession was a flay of truth. Evelyn found, to her surprise, that she felt sympathy. She saw the man who had built his ranch from borrowed capital and stubborn hunger, who had learned by being hurt that words could be unreliable and promises flighty. She also saw a loneliness that money could not fence in. That first night of unarranged urgency changed their terms. The kiss that silenced them was not a neat item in a contract. It was an electric theft of composure. It was claiming, fierce and near violent, and it left them both breathless and altered. Silas in his quarried control felt something he had not predicted, desire that refused to be cataloged solely in service of legacy. Evelyn, who had come to be an instrument in a practical bargain, discovered a raw, luminous response she had not allowed herself to expect. When he kissed her, there was an apology hidden in the pressure of his mouth, and when she answered, there was a surrender she had not budgeted for. Morning came with small changes, a smile that had not been part of Silas's vocabulary, a softened practice of courtesy, an invitation to ride out to the north pasture. On the mare Duchess and his stallion Nightfall, they moved like two pieces of a landscape finding their fit. Silas talked about fences, grasses, hay rotations, and the names of pastures as if they were personal confidences. He told how he had bought 160 acres at 20, how he had been mocked, how he had built everything with appetite and stubbornness. Evelyn listened and found herself filling the gaps in his sentences with her own surprises, humor, admiration, something like awe. In the long evenings by the library fire, she discovered that Silas's own shelves bore surprises, not merely manuals and ledgers, but volumes of Whitman dog-eared and marked, a collection of poets whose verses betrayed a man who read not to impress, but to soothe an interior. His literary tastes were a private tenderness, a contradiction to the man of markets and fences. Their evenings changed in cadence, passion that tore itself out of businesslike need, tenderness that threaded through the aftermath, and conversations that began to ask different questions, not what is expected, but what could be desired. "Would you be content here?" Silas asked one wintry night, his profile cut in lamplight. It was the kind of question men who prefer accounts over risk ask, because it required an accounting of the heart. Evelyn answered with a truth that surprised her. She was happier here than she'd ever been. The house, the land, the possibility of a nursery. They felt like a place to root, not merely a transaction to weather. "So, marry me," he said, after a silence that tasted like confession. There was no flourish, no ring flashed like a coin, only a simple, blunt proposal that contained the gravity of the plains. He wanted more than an arrangement. He wanted partnership. She laughed, then cried, then said yes, with a clarity that astonished them both. But she set conditions, a real wedding, public and plain, so no one could say she was merely the afterthought of an heir, access to the books and accounts so she could be partner in more than name, an end to pretenses. He agreed with the same earnestness he had once reserved for land purchases, and there was an odd mercy to the way their pragmatisms dovetailed into vows. Winter closed in and muffled the ranch for days. A blizzard pinned them all indoors, and the fire burned with the kind of heat that seemed to render the past more distant. They read together, he balanced ledgers and she taught herself the piano in the music room, where her fingers stumbled and then found the moorings of melody. There was a domestic peace that fit neither of them neatly, Silas learning the language of tenderness, Evelyn learning to trust a man's steadiness without mistaking it for the old loneliness she had carried. He told her more of Margaret in small, blunt sentences. She had wanted the bright social life of cities, and he had not. She left for the theater lights and never returned. The wound showed in the way he flinched at theatrical declarations and fleeting beauties. "Do you think you can love a life like mine?" he asked again, later, fear and hope threaded through his words. "I think I already do," she answered. 6 months later, she stood in front of the parish in a gown of ivory silk and lace, an entire town watching as she walked the aisle on Silas's arm. The wedding was not a pretense of romance, but a public claiming. Everyone in High Meadow, hired hands, neighboring ranchers, a single banker from the east who still thought in ledgers, turned out. People wanted to witness a thing that had transformed from a tidy arrangement into something honest and unexpected. Pregnancy followed. Morning sickness gave way to the steady swell of a new life growing beneath Evelyn's ribs. Dr. Royce monitored her regimen like a surgeon guarding a specimen, but he also cracked jokes about nursery names. And there were moments when even Silas laughed genuinely and allowed himself to be delighted in a tidy table of baby-preserving advice. The months shaped them. Evelyn found herself moving not solely as a woman, who'd fulfilled a duty, but as a partner who sat at Silas's side, poring over irrigation plans and voting on seed choices, gently asking for budgets to be explained and then mastering them. Silas, who had once barred her from ledgers, found himself asking for her opinion. He was uncomfortable with the appetite for tenderness he now harbored, and often stumbled through phrases like a man in need of new tools. You make me better," he said once, as if surprised to discover virtues in the inside of himself. They loved with a fervor that surprised them both, a passion at night, an easy companionship by day, the small and large mercies of mutual respect. They made a life that felt deliberate and wild at once, planned nursery, planned pasture, and the unplanned moments when laughter spilled across the parlor, and the house felt like a singing thing rather than a ledger. Evelyn still kept her books of poetry in a drawer of the dressing table. When dusk pooled the windows in purple sorrow, she would read lines and then find Silas across the room, reading the same verse silently and treasuring the way the words sat between them like a small trust. The land, which had been Silas's proof of a life built against the old order, softened beneath the footfalls of a woman who knew the names of children in Maple Hollow and dreamed of tiny shoes on the hall rug. On a late autumn afternoon, riding along a creek that had begun to freeze along its edges, Evelyn watched Silas stop and look at the horizon. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything we were before," he said, "and everything that could be after." There had been more than money changing hands when they signed those early stark terms. They had given each other courage, she for risking a permanent change in hopes of motherhood, he for letting his heart be known again despite past betrayals. They had chosen to face uncertainty together. When the child was born, with the first heavy snow that winter, a small son with a shock of dark hair and a cry that startled every room, the ranch felt as if it exhaled. Silas kissed their son until the baby's little face went red, and then smiled at Evelyn with a kind of gratitude that looked like worship. The ledger of their early bargain was long forgotten. What mattered was the small curled fist around Silas's finger, and how both parents kept watching each other as if they had built indeed something greater than the sum of contracts and land deeds. Years later, when neighbors came to visit and there were little boots left by the hearth and a child learning to name cattle and numbers, people would forget how the arrangement had started. They recalled only the way the family moved through rooms, the way Silas read poetry poorly and laughed at his own stumbles, the way Evelyn ran her hand over a ledger and then out to fence lines with equal confidence. There are things money buys, barns, blankets, the right to be served. There are things a ledger cannot foresee: the habit of loving, the slow settling of two stubborn people into a life neither of them planned, but both of them tended. Silas and Evelyn had both wanted to control different things: lineage and independence. And in the rough handing and receiving of their lives, they had found a more valuable currency: the choice to stay. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments where you're reading from. I love seeing the map of voices. If you enjoyed the turn from contract to companionship, hit like and subscribe for more stories of second chances and unexpected tenderness. Share this with someone who appreciates old-world grit and quiet redemption. Tomorrow, I'll share another story. Different setting, similar heart. You won't want to miss it. And one small invitation from me to you. If you'd like, tell me which character you connected with. Silas, hardened and learning to soften. Or Evelyn, who risked everything for a chance at mothering. Your thoughts shape what I write next.